Ladies and gentlemen, there comes a point in life when the seasons of our existence shift in ways far deeper than the turning of a calendar. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human psyche, once observed that at 60, the soul changes direction. What he meant was not that life ends or diminishes, but that it transforms, turning inward toward the truth we may have spent our earlier years running from, denying, or simply not recognizing. Youth is often a time of striving outwardly, seeking achievements, building careers, raising families, gathering possessions, and proving ourselves to the world. In those years, life demands we expand, that we create structures and identities that hold us steady against the chaos of existence. But as we approach the later chapters of life, something shifts. That expansion is no longer enough. The soul begins to call us in a new direction, toward meaning, wholeness, and authenticity. At 60, the body may remind us of its limits, yet the soul speaks more freely of its possibilities. No longer satisfied by society's definitions of success, we begin to ask different questions. Who am I beneath the roles I have played? What truth have I hidden in the noise of ambition and responsibility? What does it mean to live, not as the world expects me to live, but as I was truly meant to be? These are not questions of despair, but of awakening. It is as if life, after gifting us with decades of experiences, finally whispers that it is time to meet ourselves. Jung suggested that the second half of life is a spiritual journey, one where the masks we wore for acceptance and the titles we sought for recognition begin to fall away. The truth that arises is quieter but more profound. We realize that our worth has never been in what we accumulated, but in the depth of our being. The soul seeks integration, to reconcile the shadows we have ignored and to embrace the light we have dimmed. This is not regression, but the very essence of progress, a return to the source of who we are. To change direction at 60 is not to turn backward, it is to move inward. It is a chance to harvest the wisdom sown in the struggles of earlier years, to give form to the lessons learned, and to cultivate peace where once there was striving. The ego, once desperate to prove itself, loosens its grip, and the soul steps forward to guide the way. In this stage, our truth is not a philosophy we read in books or a role imposed from outside. It is the lived essence of our journey. It is forgiveness, acceptance, and freedom from the illusions that once bound us. So when Jung tells us that at 60 the soul changes direction, he is not describing decline, but the unveiling of truth. It is the moment life asks us to live not for appearances, but for authenticity. It is the moment we are invited to become whole. Would you like me to now expand this into a longer, 1,200+ word speech in the same style, like we did for your previous Carl Jung and Alan Watts speeches? Ladies and gentlemen, in the early stages of our lives, we are naturally drawn outward. As children, we are shaped by curiosity and play, learning from the world around us. As we move into youth, society begins to whisper, and then shout, its expectations into our ears. We are told to achieve, to strive, to prove ourselves. Our worth is often measured by our accomplishments, our professions, our families, and the roles we play in the collective drama of human society. We spend decades reaching outward, building identities that others can recognize and applaud. This is the natural flow of the first half of life, for without such striving, we would not develop the skills, responsibilities, and foundations that life requires of us. Yet Carl Jung, in his profound insight, recognized that at around the age of 60, this outward expansion begins to shift. Something changes, not in the sense of decay or loss, but in the sense of a new direction, a reorientation of the soul. The drive for achievement that once propelled us forward becomes quieter, and in its place emerges a longing for depth, authenticity, and meaning. It is as though life itself orchestrates this turning. We can no longer chase endlessly after outer recognition because the soul grows restless with what it perceives as repetition. At 60, many have already tasted the highs and lows of success and failure. We have built careers, raised children, carried responsibilities, and accumulated possessions. We have been applauded and perhaps overlooked, celebrated and perhaps forgotten. And yet, even after all this, a quiet truth reveals itself. The outer prizes of life are not enough to satisfy the inner hunger. That hunger is not for more wealth, more status, or more applause. It is for authenticity. The soul begins to ask, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I beneath the roles and masks? What truth lives within me that I have not yet dared to live? These are not the questions of decline. They are the questions of awakening. In the first half of life, we are builders. We construct structures that provide stability, identity, and security. We are busy establishing ourselves, answering to the needs of family, society, and ambition. But Jung observed that if we cling too tightly to these outward pursuits as we age, we risk spiritual stagnation. The soul, having played its part in building the external world, demands a new orientation. It begins to draw us inward, away from the surface glitter of life, and toward the hidden depths. At 60, the invitation is not to abandon the world, but to see it with different eyes, to recognize that true fulfillment is no longer found in endless striving, but in meaning. This shift often comes as a shock, for the values of society are rarely aligned with the values of the soul. Society celebrates youth, productivity, and expansion. It tells us that our worth lies in what we can produce, how visible we are, and how much influence we wield. But when the soul changes direction, these external values lose their hold. A person may look at their successes and feel strangely empty. They may realize that the job title they once cherished no longer defines them, that the possessions they collected offer little comfort, and that the recognition of others cannot quiet the longing within. This is not failure, it is transition. It is the moment when life calls us to a different kind of work, the work of inner discovery. Imagine a river flowing outward toward the sea. For decades it rushes forward, carving valleys, feeding fields, and creating new paths. But at a certain point, the river widens and slows. It does not cease to flow, but its movement deepens. Its purpose changes from carving out to settling in. So too does the soul at 60. The years of expansion give way to reflection, to integration, to the search for wholeness. We begin to understand that what matters most is not how loudly the world applauds us, but how honestly we live with ourselves. This turning inward is not always easy. Many resist it, clinging to the identities of their youth, desperate to stay in the game of outward striving. But resistance often leads to crisis, because the soul cannot be silenced forever. Jung suggested that the struggles many experience in later life are not signs of decline, but symptoms of avoiding this new stage of truth. When we resist the inner call, life may confront us with loss, disillusionment, or restlessness, forcing us to recognize that the old patterns no longer sustain us. But if we embrace the call, if we listen to the quiet voice within, we find a new richness unfolding. At 60, the soul does not ask for more achievements. It asks for authenticity. It asks us to remove the masks that once served us, but now weigh us down. It asks us to live in a way that aligns with our deepest values, even if those values no longer match what society rewards. It may mean finally pursuing a passion long buried, or finding peace in stillness rather than in constant motion. It may mean reconciling with parts of ourselves we ignored, forgiving wounds we carried for decades, or cultivating a sense of presence that was lost in the rush of earlier years. This turning inward does not make us smaller, it makes us whole. Consider the stories of those who, in later life, discover their greatest truth. A person who spent decades as a lawyer may finally embrace painting, not for fame, but for the joy of creation. A parent who dedicated years to raising children may begin to explore spiritual practices, meditation, or community service. A leader who once sought recognition may now find meaning in mentoring quietly, without need for applause. These transformations are not failures of ambition. They are the flowering of the soul. They reveal that life at 60 is not a closing chapter, but the beginning of a deeper narrative. Jung himself often spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole, of integrating the many parts of ourselves into a unified truth. At 60, individuation becomes urgent. The outer world has served its purpose. Now the inner world demands attention. The ego, which once drove us to prove ourselves, begins to loosen its grip. We see through its illusions and recognize that what we sought outside has always been within. To shift from outer achievement to inner meaning is to move from performance to presence, from striving to being, from illusion to truth. This is why Jung's insight is so profound. He reminds us that 60 is not a point of decline, but of transformation. It is the soul's way of guiding us toward the essence of life after decades of practice in the art of survival. When we listen to that guidance, we discover that the second half of life is not about less, it is about more. More authenticity, more depth, more alignment with who we truly are. The prizes of youth are temporary, but the truth discovered at 60 is eternal. Ladies and gentlemen, as Carl Jung explored the mystery of human life, he recognized that the soul carries within it not just the light of our achievements and virtues, but also the shadows of all that we repress, deny, and leave unacknowledged. In the first half of life, we are often too busy to confront these hidden aspects of ourselves. We wear masks to fit into society, we project images to meet the expectations of others, and we deny the parts of ourselves that do not align with who we think we should be. This is not done maliciously, it is simply part of survival. To build families, careers, and identities, we must sometimes push certain truths into the background. But as we enter the later stages of life, particularly around 60, something remarkable happens. The soul demands integration. It calls us to bring together the fragments we have scattered, to reconcile the light and shadow within, and to discover wholeness. This process is not about perfection, nor about becoming something new. It is about becoming complete. Integration means allowing the fullness of our humanity to be seen and accepted. It means acknowledging the fears we suppressed, the dreams we abandoned, the wounds we carried, and the joys we postponed. At 60, these unacknowledged parts often rise to the surface, no longer content to remain hidden. Life itself seems to orchestrate this emergence. We might find old regrets resurfacing, or unresolved conflicts demanding attention. Memories long forgotten may return with unexpected force, or desires we thought we had buried may stir within us again. These are not signs of weakness. They are the soul's way of guiding us toward completion. For many, this confrontation with the shadow is uncomfortable. It may feel easier to continue pretending, to maintain the same roles, to cling to the identity we have carefully crafted. But Jung understood that true peace cannot be found in denial. The soul grows restless when parts of ourselves are excluded from the story of our life. Integration requires courage, for it asks us to look into the mirror without turning away, to admit that we are both light and dark, capable of kindness and cruelty, wisdom and ignorance, strength and fragility. To accept this duality is to begin the work of becoming whole. At 60, the urgency of this work increases, for the soul knows that time is precious. The masks of youth no longer serve us as they once did. The image we projected to the world may still hold some weight, but deep down we know it is not the full truth. A businessman who has spent his life projecting strength may finally face the vulnerability he denied. A woman who carried the weight of responsibility for others may recognize the forgotten parts of herself that yearn for freedom and joy. A parent who shaped their identity around raising children may realize the need to rediscover who they are outside of that role. Each of these realizations is an invitation to integration. Wholeness is not achieved by rejecting the shadow, but by embracing it. To do so is not to indulge in destructive impulses, but to acknowledge their existence and transform them into wisdom. The anger we once denied may, when faced honestly, reveal a deep desire for justice. The fear we carried may uncover a longing for safety and love. The envy we felt may point to aspirations we neglected. Even our failures, when integrated, become sources of compassion for ourselves and others. This is the alchemy of the soul, turning the raw material of our shadows into the gold of understanding. Jung often emphasized that individuation, the process of becoming whole, is the task of the second half of life. In our earlier years, the ego dominates, striving to define us and protect us from what we fear. But as we age, the ego alone is no longer enough. The soul begins to whisper, then to demand, that we expand beyond the ego's narrow limits. At 60, the invitation is clear. Reconcile what has been divided within you, integrate the rejected parts, and discover the peace that comes from wholeness. This integration is not a solitary act. It often involves healing relationships, making peace with family, forgiving ourselves for mistakes, or reconciling with those we once resented. At 60, many people feel drawn to repair the connections that were fractured in earlier years. We may realize that carrying resentment only burdens us, while forgiveness liberates both ourselves and others. We may recognize that estrangement from loved ones reflects an estrangement within ourselves, and by reaching out, we heal both. The soul seeks wholeness not only within, but also in the web of relationships that shape our lives. The search for integration also leads us to rediscover the spiritual dimension of life. For in recognizing our shadows and our wounds, we are reminded of our dependence on something greater than ourselves, whether that is God, nature, or the vast mystery of existence. Spiritual practices that once seemed abstract now take on deep meaning, for they provide a path toward reconciliation. Meditation, prayer, reflection, or simple stillness become ways of welcoming the fragments home, of allowing the soul to rest in unity rather than division. At 60, many feel drawn to this spiritual awakening, not as a doctrine imposed from outside, but as a living truth rising from within. Wholeness is not about erasing the past, but about integrating it. It is about seeing that every mistake, every regret, every triumph, and every joy are threads woven into the fabric of our being. Without one thread, the pattern is incomplete. At 60, the soul invites us to step back and see the entire tapestry of our life, to appreciate its depth and texture, even where the colors clash. In this perspective, nothing is wasted. Everything belongs. When we embrace integration, we find a new freedom. We are no longer enslaved by the need to appear perfect, nor haunted by the fear of our flaws. We can live more honestly, with a gentleness toward ourselves and others. We realize that wholeness is not about being flawless, but about being authentic. It is about standing in the fullness of our humanity and saying, "This is who I am, with all my light and shadow, all my strength and weakness, all my mistakes and triumphs. Such acceptance does not diminish us, it makes us radiant. Jung's insight that the soul seeks integration at 60 is not a prescription for withdrawal from life, but an invitation to engage with it more deeply. By embracing our shadows and reconciling our contradictions, we open the door to compassion, wisdom, and peace. We no longer need to prove ourselves, for we understand that we are already complete. Ladies and gentlemen, when Carl Jung spoke about the journey of the soul in the second half of life, he emphasized something that often goes overlooked in our culture: the deep human need for integration. In the first half of life, we are so focused on building an identity, on establishing ourselves in the external world, that we rarely pay attention to the fragmented parts of our inner world. We wear masks to fulfill our roles, to meet expectations, to survive in a competitive society. We put forward the qualities that bring approval and recognition, while pushing aside the impulses, emotions, and desires that feel inconvenient or dangerous. Over time, these repressed aspects form what Jung called the shadow, the part of ourselves we do not acknowledge but that continues to live within us. By the time we reach 60, the weight of this shadow cannot be ignored. The soul itself begins to call us toward integration, toward wholeness, toward an acceptance of all that we are. This call to integration is not about creating a new identity, but about reconciling the many identities we have carried. At 60, we may look back and realize that we have lived as different versions of ourselves. There is the ambitious self who chased career success, the nurturing self who devoted time to family, the social self who sought belonging, the fearful self who avoided risks, and the creative self who may have been silenced. Each of these selves is a fragment of a larger whole, and wholeness comes when we stop denying any of them and begin to weave them together into a single, authentic life. The danger of ignoring this work is that the unacknowledged parts begin to emerge in unhealthy ways. Unresolved anger might manifest as bitterness, denied vulnerability as isolation, or ignored creativity as emptiness. But when we listen to the soul and begin the work of integration, those same forces can transform into sources of vitality and wisdom. At 60, the masks of youth start to feel heavy. The image we projected for decades may no longer serve us. A person who lived only to prove themselves may suddenly feel exhausted by competition. A caregiver who sacrificed their own needs may finally hear the voice of their neglected self. A leader who built authority on control may realize they long for gentleness. These realizations can be disorienting, but they are not signs of failure. They are signs of growth. The soul is reminding us that life was never meant to be lived in fragments, and that the true task of maturity is not to become flawless, but to become whole. To integrate the self is to embrace the shadow with honesty. Jung never saw the shadow as purely negative. He understood it as containing parts of the psyche that, when denied, create imbalance, but when acknowledged, bring strength. The anger we repressed might, when integrated, give us the courage to stand up for ourselves and others. The envy we felt might reveal the unlived life within us, urging us to pursue forgotten passions. Even the mistakes we made, when faced openly, can become sources of humility and compassion. Integration is the art of transforming shadow into insight, wounds into wisdom, and fragmentation into unity. The process of integration also reshapes our relationships. At 60, many people feel drawn to reconcile with those they once resented, to forgive family members, or to heal old conflicts. This is not simply about repairing external ties. It is about healing the fractures within. Often, the people we resist forgiving reflect the parts of ourselves we resist acknowledging. To forgive another is, in a profound way, to accept something about ourselves. Integration demands this kind of courage, for it asks us to stop running from our pain and to recognize it as part of the whole story of who we are. It is important to understand that integration does not erase the past, it reinterprets it. Every experience, even the painful ones, becomes part of the fabric of our wholeness. At 60, the soul invites us to look back not with regret, but with understanding. The failures that once haunted us can be seen as teachers. The conflicts that shaped us can be understood as necessary lessons. The choices we made, whether wise or unwise, contributed to the person we are today. To integrate is to allow every thread, every color, every texture of our life to belong. Nothing is wasted when seen through the lens of wholeness. This journey toward wholeness also opens the door to spiritual awakening. Many who reach 60 feel drawn to questions that go beyond material success. The search is no longer for more possessions or recognition, but for connection with something greater, whether it be God, nature, or the vast mystery of life itself. Spirituality becomes less about doctrine and more about experience, less about external ritual and more about inner alignment. The desire for integration naturally leads us to a deeper spiritual awareness, because to accept all of ourselves is to accept our place in the larger order of existence. We come to see that our struggles and shadows are not obstacles to spirituality, but gateways into it. Wholeness brings a kind of freedom that the first half of life rarely allows. When we stop dividing ourselves into acceptable and unacceptable parts, we no longer have to perform for the world or hide from ourselves. We can live with honesty, transparency, and peace. This freedom is not flashy, but it is profound. It allows us to be gentle with ourselves, to offer compassion to others, and to rest in the truth of who we are. At 60, when the soul seeks integration, it is not demanding that we erase our flaws, but that we accept them as part of the greater whole. Only then can we stop pretending and start living authentically. Integration also means embracing the paradoxes of life. We are strong and weak, wise and foolish, selfless and selfish, all at once. To deny one side of the paradox is to live in imbalance, but to embrace both is to live in truth. The young often struggle with these paradoxes, trying to resolve them into a single identity. But at 60, we can begin to see that paradox is the very essence of life. Integration allows us to live with these contradictions without fear, knowing that they are part of the richness of being human. The journey to wholeness is not easy, and it does not happen overnight. It requires patience, courage, and humility. It may involve painful self-reflection, honest conversations, and letting go of illusions we carried for decades. But it also brings great rewards. The person who embraces integration finds a sense of peace that no external achievement can provide. They discover a unity within themselves that radiates outward into their relationships and their view of the world. They become less concerned with appearances and more rooted in authenticity. They are no longer fragmented, but whole. Jung's vision of the soul seeking integration at 60 is not a warning, but a gift. It is the soul's way of reminding us that life's true purpose is not just to build outward structures, but to discover inward unity. The roles we played, the masks we wore, the shadows we denied, all of these were part of the journey, but they were never the destination. The destination is wholeness, and at 60, the soul reveals that the path to wholeness begins with embracing everything we are.